Welcome back. We will reconvene in another minute. Please get settled. Please take your seats. Thank you. We will now begin our next panel session, the third panel session, which will deliberate on the topic violations of economic rights by China. For this, may I invite our speakers to take the seats. We have Ms. Chukki, former Special Appointee for Human Rights, Tibet Bureau, Geneva. We have Dr.Adrian Zenz, Senior Fellow in China Studies at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, Washington, D.C., and Mr. Marco Respinti, Director in Charge, Winter. For this panel, the chairperson is Representative Tashi Phuntsok, Office of Tibet, Brussels. Please take the seats. Thank you very much. Now, also, since we are running 15 minutes late, this panel will run until 12:45. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm very pleased to be your host for this session, third session of this Geneva Forum 2021. I'm very honored to be with a very eminent panel of speakers on the topic of violation of economic rights by China. We have three very prominent speakers: Dr. Adrian Zenz, Ms. Chukki, and Mr. Marco Respinti. The session will discuss about the violation of economic rights by China, and I'm made to understand that this topic has been placed in view of forthcoming United Nations review about China's position on these matters. So the panels will speak on the subject, but in the second session, I would like to think that our panelists will also speak how we could make China accountable for these violations. So the session will constitute by presentation of each speaker for 15 minutes, and then, time permitting, we will have questions from the audience. And as I said before, in the second part of the session, we would like to address really the most important part, why China goes on violating numerous rights and laws of the world, and then is not held accountable at all. And in certain terms, we also heard certain frustrations about lack of action by the free world when violations happen and China continues with its violation of rules with impunity. First of all, I would like to present Dr. Adrian Zenz, is a senior fellow in China Studies at the Victim of Communism Memorial Foundation, Washington, D.C., and supervises PhD students at the European School of Culture and Theology, Kontal, Germany. His research focus is on China's ethnic policy, public recruitment in Tibet and Xinjiang, Beijing's internment campaign in Xinjiang, and China's domestic security budgets. Dr. Zenz is author of Tibetan Nests Under Threat and co-editor of Mapping Amdo Dynamics of Change. He has played a leading role in the analysis of leaked China's government documents to include the China's Kabul's and Caracas list. Dr. Zenz is an advisor to the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China and a frequent contributor to the international media. Dr. Zenz will be speaking for 15 minutes on violations of economic rights, coercive poverty alleviation through labor transfers in the Tibet Autonomous Region. Dr. Zenz, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to this important event and this important panel, because the economy is, of course, an area where China has very much sought to strategically leverage, as we have heard, get influence, diplomatic influence. So Chinese use of economic power to secure global political influence has been very paramount. And also domestically, President Xi Jinping is very much justifying his rule and his dominance in Chinese politics with signature initiatives such as eradicating absolute poverty by 2020 and similar domestic initiatives. For China, traditionally, using development and economic growth has been an important legitimizer to try to legitimize its sovereignty and rule over restive ethnic minority regions, notably in Xinjiang and Tibetan regions. I'll be speaking on coercive poverty alleviation through labor transfers in the Tibet Autonomous Region specifically. And the whole notion or concept of poverty alleviation and how it is being coercively used, I think is an increasingly important research topic, especially with Xi Jinping's signature initiative and the invention of so-called targeted poverty alleviation, which combines the use of poverty alleviation through digital databases and linking it with domestic security apparatus and the domestic surveillance apparatus. Conceptually speaking, we have coercive labor frameworks that China has been pioneering under Xi Jinping in recent years. And here I would like to make an important conceptual distinction between the forced labor that's linked to Xinjiang's re-education or internment camps and the more general forced labor that's linked to poverty alleviation through labor transfers, which we find in Xinjiang, Tibet, and potentially also other regions of China. The forced labor linked to the camps specifically is part of a de-extremification policy in Xinjiang against the Uyghurs and other ethnic groups that looks to place detainees from re-education camps into forced labor placement. The scope is not entirely clear. We can assume it being possibly several 100,000. Kashgar in 2018 alone was speaking of 100,000. This tends to be non-seasonal factory work, and it's quite specifically limited to the Xinjiang's re-education camps. Now, when we speak about coercive poverty alleviation or coercive labor in Tibet, we are not ruling out that there are firstly re-education detention facilities in Xinjiang, whose scope is, in Tibet, whose scope is unclear, and that there is also some link of vocational training in the region, although that is quite unclear at the moment, and the scope especially is unclear. But I'm today specifically speaking about a coercive labor system for which we have comprehensive and significant evidence, which is the transfer of rural surplus laborers from agriculture to other sectors through targeted poverty alleviation, which we find both in Xinjiang and Tibet. And the scope in Xinjiang is that up to 1.6 million in Xinjiang ethnic minorities are at risk of coercive labor through labor transfers. And in the TAR, it would be several 100,000. Here we have to speak of a risk of coercion. It's not like the camp labor in Xinjiang. It's not 100% coercion. There's, of course, always a possibility that locals will be happy about a particular poverty alleviation policy. They may benefit financially, or it might suit them, or they want a job, or they want vocational training. These things are potentially beneficial, just that the way they're being implemented in these regions makes them coercive, and the government is actually very direct and open about their coercive nature, meaning if people happen to not want to participate, if it affects their lifestyle, if it forces them to change their life and tears apart communities, and therefore it's a threat to a religious life, to traditional lifestyles, etc., then the government will use coercion of a scale and depth that has not been seen in China, certainly since the Cultural Revolution. The jobs ranges from very local in being placed to jobs in the same county to cross-provincial, meaning labor transfers to Eastern China. And here we have the transfers of Uyghurs we've heard about to factories across China, and the same happens with Tibetans. Tibetans are being transferred to cooperating factories and companies in Eastern China. So we need to keep in mind most labor transfers are local. The main goal is non-agricultural employment. So it's not necessarily a geographical transfer, it's primarily a sectoral transfer from primary sector to secondary and tertiary sectors. However, it does involve often relocation. Now, only about 1% of these are cross-provincial, meaning only about 1% of Tibetans and Uyghurs are being transferred outside their province. But we do have fairly significant dislocation within those regions, because nearly 10%, about 9%, are being transferred to other prefectures, which entails significant urbanization and significant dislocation. But even the 90% that are local, even though it's not a major relocation geographically, it can be a significant form of displacement, because you can be displaced from a very remote rural pastoral setting to, for example, a county seat or a factory park in a township or county seat. And that by itself is a very significant change of location and livelihood. Of course, it's also possible that the displacements increase in the future. This is just a pilot. It starts, but then it could be that stronger population transfers are possible. In 2012, the Chamdo region in the Tibet Autonomous Region, as China calls it, that's a Chinese designation, started to initiate so-called military-style training for surplus labor force transfer for pastoral and agricultural regions. Chamdo pioneered a much more coercive military drill-style labor transfer and vocational training in the Tibet Autonomous Region, which was formally established in the 13th Five-Year Plan starting 2016. Some pictures that these are pictures from 2014 from Chamdo, showing the military drill, vocational training that is supposed to really ensure that the Tibetans participate in labor transfer. In March 2019, the scheme became region-wide in the entire Tibet Autonomous Region. A key new policy titled the Farmer and Pastoralist Training and Labor Transfer Action Plan, including military drill, work discipline, which is important because the Chinese say the Tibetans are not disciplined. They don't like to be herded into factory work. And then, of course, Chinese language, lectures on Chinese law and work ethics, aiming to, quote, enhance laborers' sense of discipline to comply with national laws and regulations. So there's also the point that if we ship you to a Chinese factory, you need to obey the factory management. And it's an order-oriented method. Jobs are arranged first. The companies basically hand the government a list. We need 100 people who do this kind of work and 200 who do that work, and then the government takes them and trains them and delivers them to the company. I have to skip through some of these through time reasons. There's financial incentives, companies and intermediaries. There's like private intermediaries who arrange labor transfers and they get money and subsidies for that. There's detailed quotas and so on that need to be achieved. There's very, very high pressure in the system and cadres who don't comply, cadres who fail to achieve their local quota get punished through a disciplinary action within the party system. This is a picture from 2020. They learn hospitality, how to become a waitress wearing military uniforms. The quota set for 2020, which were achieved, by the way, spoke about the transfer of at least 55,000 people within the TER, meaning they get displaced from their prefecture. They get transferred to a different prefecture, 5,000 to other parts of China, so that's about 1%. The total training target was 600,000. In the first 7 months, the TER achieved nearly all of that. As you can tell, they were transferred to other parts of TER or other parts of China or locally. Each Tibetan prefecture and county is assigned a specific transfer quota, and this scheme did cover the entire TER. Workers are transferred often in a group-style point-to-point fashion, where they're put on trains or buses and then they are shipped off. To ensure, the point is to replace a previous system that was more individual and voluntary, meaning if you want to get vocational training, here's the training. If you want to get a job, here's your job. You go to your job, it starts on August 1st, right? But now it's like, okay, 500 people working in factory X in another prefecture, you all get placed on the same bus system, and we bring you there, and you will be there by August 1st. And the government officials make sure that's happening. There are significant similarities to Xinjiang, to the labor transfer in Xinjiang, which is Xinjiang has 2 different systems of forced labor, which makes them really, together, they're really huge. The one that is very directly linked to the internment camps, people placed directly from internment camps to forced labor, and then the labor transfer. Poverty elevation through labor transfer in Xinjiang takes local Uyghurs who have not been in a camp really. It's complementary to the camp system. It takes local Uyghurs and then transfers them to jobs. And the coercive, they also get military-style drill training in vocational training centers. Some of them can be securitized almost like a camp. We know very little about the facilities in the Tibet Autonomous Region. And of course, yeah, so it's a complementary system. The difference to Xinjiang is there's not evidence of internment camps that are directly linked to the labor transfer system. Of course, Xinjiang has internment camps. Of course, the Tibet Autonomous Region has detention facilities and does practice re-education on an unknown scale. But it's not linked to the vocational training and labor transfer system. Now, the question is, so how does the military drill-style vocational training happen in Tibetan regions? The answer is it does happen, and we have some limited information about newly constructed so-called training bases, 实训基地 in Chinese. There's very little evidence of what these facilities are like, or if there's accompanying police forces, or to what extent. And it's a really good question. Maybe the Chinese authorities learned to withhold some of this information after the exposing of the system in Xinjiang. Or maybe the system works differently, so this is a subject to study. These are all very recent phenomena. This is kind of one facility that I've been able to analyze that does show some signs of securitization. Vocational training school for labor transfer that has a surrounding wall and a fence and some interior fencing. And it's quite clear you can't just get in and out of that place. Those who are being trained, they are being kept there, and then they are afterwards transferred to their work destination. And there's limited evidence of the securitization that surrounds this. But we do know that the Tibet Autonomous Region has a very sophisticated police state that was set up by Chen Quanguo, Party Secretary of Tibet 2011-16, who then became the Party Secretary of Xinjiang, set up a very similar securitization system. So very important to understand the coercive nature of economic development and poverty alleviation in Tibetan regions is how they are seamlessly interfaced with the local police state and surveillance state, grassroots cadres, village work teams going door to door, the police and surveillance state, advanced surveillance technology, big data analysis. This is all very important for understanding the coercive nature. And sometimes when you think, well, if they're not like in a re-education camp and directly go to labor, but it's the open-air police state that has been created in Tibet and in Xinjiang that really ensures how people are operating according to government orders. It's very important to understand. Maybe it's less dramatic, not as media effective, but the net effect of people having to comply is in the end fairly similar, really. Also very concerning is the ramping up, in the context of poverty elevation, the ramping up of land transfer and herd transfer to state-run cooperatives. Quote, nomads become shareholders. So their usage rights to their animals or to their land is being surrendered to a state-run cooperative where they become wage laborers and earn supposedly a dividend. Or maybe they do. They could even be financially better off, possibly, supposedly, we don't know. But it's a coercive conversion and transformation of livelihoods, of traditional livelihood. It places Tibetans under much greater state control, being wage labor. One state government talked about Tibetans are to put down the whip, walk out of the pasture and enter the labor market. And it's linked to the labor transfer seamlessly because the goal is to get all Tibetans into wage employment. In my opinion, this sort of harks back to the forced collectivization of the 1950s. And there's really a lot more we have to understand and research about it. So we see a new turn in Beijing's ethnic minority policy where the transition between securitization and poverty elevation is seamless. There's no telling where coercion stops and local agency begins. There's a new micromanaging of people's lives, securitized. And this is my final slide. Beijing used to bank or rely on a gradual and sort of maybe half-voluntary process of assimilation through economic incentives, saying, Tibetans, you have a choice. If you want to be integrated, you have to assimilate, you have to learn Chinese and so on. But now, there's a much greater and much more intrusive, data-driven and policing-driven micromanaging of locals by the state, by the police state, based on sophisticated surveillance systems, databases, and much more intensive forms of social and grassroots control. And I think that is really where everything is headed, and this is the long-term solution that I see of Beijing for these restive ethnic minority regions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zen. Very detailed presentation, and we are aware that his report was made public in earlier years, and it has caught the eye of the world, contextualizing the situation in Tibet vis-à-vis the current Xinjiang labor camp issues. Before I move to the next speaker, I would like to ask Dr. Zen two questions. One is, after the publication of your report and the media and public outcry, what is your assessment of the reaction of China or the reaction of the free world towards this coercive labor transfer? And secondly, in view of the declaration that we would be adopting in the evening, what recommendations would you present to stop such kind of coercive labor transfers in Tibet?
Yes. So China's dramatic actions in Xinjiang have, really came to dominate the narrative of human rights violations and captured the attention, and the Tibetan situation kind of faded a bit into the background as a more sort of maybe somewhat less dramatic in some ways situation. I think what my research did, my research really showed how China has a fundamental approach, a subtle, long-term approach to bring regions under tight-fisted control and change livelihoods in the long term. And this method is also actually being used in Xinjiang on top of the re-education camps, because they are not by themselves not enough, maybe. So you have to try to change everybody's livelihood, not just the people who are in the camps. And the same in Tibet, and I'm sure also in bordering regions, so further research is going to be needed. To really show that there's this targeted poverty alleviation is a totalitarian approach that is not as dramatic, and it's couched in positive language, right? Poverty alleviation is a good thing. So China is really has a diplomatic strategy of packaging a police state kind of control in sort of what we would think a positive concept. And by doing so, it's making it harder for countries to respond or criticize, or trying to make it harder. And I've found a significant lack of response, to answer your question. I think there has been a media outcry. There have been politicians who have been making statements, yes. But I think there has been a real lack of real action or proposals. I do not see specific proposals. I see the European Union is dragging its feet over forced labor, right? Forced labor really needs to be an issue. Do Europeans want to have products made with forced labor by Uyghurs or Tibetans? I don't think so. And I think this is, for my recommendation, I would exhort Western countries in particular to follow their own laws. Forced labor is illegal. Forced labor is illegal, firstly. And secondly, to do more to expose how China is portraying its poverty alleviation and is trying to recast the very definition of human rights as the right to economic development promoted by the government. That's how China tries to redefine human rights. So I would recommend that you would try to focus on uncovering and targeting the Chinese strategy of packaging its human rights violations under the guise of development.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zenz. Now, I will move to the second speaker. Second speaker is Thinlay Chickila, graduated from Harvard Law School with master's degree in law, LLM in 2018, and joined the Central Tibetan Administration on her return to India. For 2 years, she worked at the Bureau here in Geneva as special appointee for human rights till 27 August 2021, till recently. Prior to this, she worked as a researcher at the UN, EU, and Human Rights Desk at the Department of Information and International Relations in Dharamsala at CTA. She worked as a researcher at the same department and same desk. Earlier to that, she worked as an in-house counsel to Tata Motors Limited. Tata is a very huge conglomerate in India. Motors Limited heading its South India legal department as a regional legal manager, South India, for almost 5 years. She received her bachelor's degree in law, LLB, in India from SDM Law College, Mangalore University in South India. She is very fluent in South Indian language, especially Kannada. So she comes with a very huge legal background, and today she will be speaking on overview of economic rights violation in/by China, and I think her footprint of work on this is also present in the brochure that presented to you for this forum. So Chickila, the floor is yours, and after which I will have a question to you also. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those generous words, Kongotesh Phuntsok. First of all, I would like to thank Kongo Chimarinzila, Kanditsumula, and Chesanla for inviting me to this forum. Having been involved in the planning stage and structure stage, this is very heartening to be involved again, seeing the forum taking shape. So thank you so much for the invitation. As Kongo Tashpinzullah said, my topic is rather a broad overview of economic rights violations in/by China. I would, before going into the topic, just give a very, very brief background about the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Convention. So this is one of the conventions which forms the bedrock of international human rights. It is part of the International Bills of Human Rights, and along with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So this committee is very different from the UPR review, which happened in 2018. This review is done by the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, whereas the UPR is done by the member states. This is one of the distinctions. So China signed this covenant in 1997 and was later ratified in 2001. China is currently undergoing the third reporting cycle. It's supposed to be held every once in 5 years, but again, because it is a member's self-analysis report that has to be first presented to the committee, and then the committee starts the review cycle, China has always been dilly-dallying. So since its ratification, which was in 2001, there have been barely 2 reviews so far, and currently we are in the third review cycle. Just so that we are in the same understanding, generally when there is a review of a country, especially on the treaties, so first, as I said, the country that is currently China presents its self-assessment report on how so far the covenant has been implemented, and then the committee issues a list of issues based on that report, and then the state party submits the written replies to the list of issues that have been issued by the committee, and then there is a sort of constructive dialogue between the committee members and then the member states, and then committee issues the concluding observations along with the recommendations, and then the follow-up happens. So far, just for the understanding of everybody here, China is currently in the second stage. That is, the list of issues have been submitted to China based on its reports. So in every stage of this cycle, there is an active participation by the civil society groups and other stakeholders. So while the committee was framing the list of issues, we received a very important opportunity to present the paper and our reports on what are the major cultural, economic, and social rights violations by China. So this list of issues have been sent. Now China has to submit its reply. We are hoping that when the actual dialogue happens, which is the fourth stage, it will be in the next year, so that we are all in the same page, because it appears that there needs to be a little bit of clarification on what the stage and structure is. At the stage of the fourth, that is the dialogue, it is very, very important that there is more participation so that the committee understands what are the major sort of violations and where China needs to be questioned. And that is why, as a backdrop, we are holding this forum on this particular violations so that a general consensus can be built on what are the major violations that are being carried out by China against Tibetans, Uyghurs, and of course the mainland Chinese itself. So going to what are the economic rights under the ICCER, first would be the right to work, right to fair wage and safe working conditions under Article 7, and then right to form and join trade unions under Article 8. So these are the major sort of economic rights that are outlined in the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Over and above this, there are overarching rights, or you can say underlying rights, that is the right to self-determination, right to development, and right of non-discrimination. Of course, also sort of having legislations framed in a way that they are non-discriminative. So the reason why I wrote economic rights violations in/by China is when you talk about economic rights violations by China, there are, of course, domestic rights violations, but with the advent of Belt and Road initiatives, what we have seen is that China has gone beyond its borders in violating the economic rights of people across the world. So you have huge economic rights violations that are being carried out wherever the Belt and Road Initiative has set foot. So in order to compress the topic, I have kind of narrowed it down to say that economic rights violations in China by China. So again, this I should have said in the beginning. When I say China, I'm talking about the government of China controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, just so that it does not hurt the sentiments of any person or individual. So when we talk about the economic rights violations, one of the first thing that we have seen is that the Chinese Human Rights Action Plan for 2016 and 2020, it outlined that one of the first objectives of this Human Rights Action Plan would be to give prominence in implementing the economic, social, and cultural rights. Whereas what we have seen in the latest report of 2017 by the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, it is a UN Special Rapporteur. The visit of the Special Rapporteur visited China, especially the Yunnan province in 2017, and after the visit, submitted a detailed report on what sort of poverty eradication mechanism has been done by China as it has claimed. One of the major parts that when you look at the report is that China has systematically failed at bringing out any sort of domestic legislation on preserving and guaranteeing these economic, social rights. So far, what China has done is that it has signed the treaty, it has ratified the treaty, but when you ask for accountability, it has always said that until and unless these rights are transformed into domestic laws, we will not have any sort of implementation mechanism. And therefore, so far, even after almost 20 years of ratification, China has systematically failed to form any sort of domestic legislations protecting these rights and thereby stopping the implementation of these rights and questioning of these rights. So focusing on right to work. When you talk about right to work, it involves right to choose the work, right not to be unfairly deprived of the work, right of access to employment, and it also implicitly forbids the forced labor. So Dr. Zenz has given a very detailed presentation on what sort of coercive nature of labor that we are seeing in China, especially in Xinjiang and Tibet. But what we have to understand is that this right, a lot of people sort of get confused that, okay, there is right to work, but there is no right to not be forced to work, which comes under the forced labor. However, the general comments section, paragraph 18, clearly states that this right to work includes right not to be forced to work. So I will skip over the forced labor camps in Xinjiang, which has been detailed. However, I would definitely like to add that there is a report by Tibet Advocacy Coalition which also expands these vocational trainings to the prisoners. So there is prison labor as well as former prisoners. When we talk about former prisoners, it is very important to understand that the Tibetan political prisoners are subjected to a lot of discriminations. And even after when they are out of the prison, they are denied of health facilities, a lot of welfare benefits. So by subjecting them to vocational trainings, there is definitely an extension of that forced or coercive nature of labor in this state. Secondly, it would be creating barriers to employment. What we have seen is that there is an imposition of Mandarin language requirement. Of course, when we say things like this, generally people are like, okay, definitely the employers are entitled to have some sort of language requirements, but this is not the case. The case is that they impose that only Mandarin speakers are given an opportunity to work, which subjectively makes the larger plan of making Tibet a Sinicized state. Of course, the same applies to East Turkestan as well. And then there is a systematic denial or restriction on obtaining permits and loans for starting a business. Tibetans, Uyghurs, Southern Mongolians, they always face this entry to the barrier of the market, whereby they are not given access to loans and also not given access to even permits. For example, there was a report recently where we have seen that Tibetans are denied of tourist guide license, which basically means that they do not have the permits to be tourist guides and therefore the right to work. As a larger picture, we can also talk about the migrant laborers who are facing the sort of restrictions because of hukou system. Yesterday, there was a lot of discussion about the Beijing Olympics 2022. A lot of rights groups have called this a genocide game. One of the reasons why this is happening is because if you look at the sort of sponsors that we have, this is a very important report that has been published by ASPI, where you can see that Olympic as a structure always has a lot of worldwide partners, and then official partners, and then again the state partners. In this report, there are clear connections and allegations how these partners, these companies which are partnering or sponsoring the Olympics are sort of connected to the larger forced labor issue and internment camps. For example, in the worldwide Olympic partners, we have Alibaba, which provides platform to Yanchen, which is definitely seen and noted to be employing people from the forced labor camps. And again, Panasonic, Samsung, Anta, Flytech, these are all companies which have employed people from the internment camps. So as Dr. Zenz was talking about, there being intermediaries who are supplying these laborers. So these laborers are being supplied to the companies which in turn are supplying to this global supply chain. Similarly, we have the official sponsors of Beijing. This is one of the most important group, the HYX group, which has employees, detainees who are from the re-education camps. And one of the most important aspects of this group is that the Olympic uniform for the Winter Olympics 2022 was granted to this group in 2019. This basically gives you the picture of why there are rights groups calling the Olympics, especially the 2022 Winter Olympics, as genocide games. Then, moving on, we have the right to fair wage and safe working conditions. This, again, has been so very well articulated by Dr. Zenz, where he has said that there are coercive measures being implemented, because it is not just that the people should have right to work, but also they should have an access to the safe working conditions, whereby if you look at what has been discussed so far, it clearly means that the people who are in these internment camps or who are subjected under these various programs are not able to work in safe working conditions. Also, the question of fair wage. Definitely there have been a lot of discussion on right to equal pay, but when it comes to the Tibetans, Uyghurs, and other so-called ethnic minorities, what we have seen is that there is a huge wage disparity for the Tibetans, Uyghurs, while comparing the same to the Han Chinese or the mainland Chinese for the same work that has been done. So, for example, there was a latest report which said that there is a difference of almost $400 for the same amount, that is work that has been paid to Uyghurs and the amount that has been paid to mainland Chinese. Then we have the right to form and join trade unions. Of course, the major concern that we have always raised is that China has always violated the right to assembly and right to form unions. And in this case, I wanted to discuss one case, but I think I'll just go to the final conclusion of the case, which speaks about connecting the right to strike, right to form trade union, to freedom of assembly and association. This is one of the important cases that we have seen in from European Court of Human Rights. In China, there is only one trade union that is allowed. That is the All China Federation of Trade Unions. It has a massive membership and staff. However, when you look at the sort of, when you talk about trade unions, you always talk about welfare of the laborers. But when it comes to this trade union, what we have consistently seen is that they do not work for the welfare of the workers. It is rather the party's diktat that has been sort of ordered, obeyed, and promoted. Last article that I'll deal with is the right of non-discrimination, Article 2. This article clearly talks about prohibiting any sort of discrimination on the basis of race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other legal opinion or other opinions, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. In 2018, the concluding remarks of the Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the experts have clearly noted that there is a marked discrimination when it comes to these rights of Uyghurs and other so-called ethnic minorities. Especially an example would be the discrimination in public sector. That is, there was job notification for police recruitments in 2020 for the Lithang County, where we have seen that people who are one of the major conditions for accepting or even applying for the job is that you should not have participated in any sort of separatist activities. When you talk about separatist activities, China has a very, very vague and broad definition. Any sort of even inkling of complaint or discontentment is considered to be a separatist activity. Therefore, it sort of removes a large portion of Tibetans, Uyghurs, who want to apply for the job but are discriminated just because they have a different political opinion. Especially also in the private sector, there was a job advertisement by Lens Technology in 2019, which clearly said that if you are Uyghur, if you are a Tibetan, please do not even bother applying. So that is the sort of discrimination that we are seeing. Right to development, this is one right that needs to be understood, whereby we have seen that when it comes to the nomadic resettlement, we generally talk about right to food and right to livelihood, right to housing. But with the current list of issues, what we have seen is that this right is now being moved to include the forced resettlement of Tibetan nomads. There is a very important judgment by the African Commission, which talks about the state having a duty to obtain free, prior, and informed consent and adequate compensation. When it comes to the forced relocation of Tibetan nomads, we have seen that there is definitely no any sort of free or prior or informed consent, and over and above, they do not even receive adequate compensation. I do have a segment which talks about the way forward, but since Kongotash Pinzula said that he wants to keep it for the next half, I will conclude here.
That is a nice way of putting that she would take more time later on. But I'm very glad that she tried her best to present her long and detailed analysis in 15 minutes. You will get time, I'm sure, later on. But I have this comment to make. All of us who have been in this struggle for the last 60 years have always looked to the United Nations as a symbol of our hope and our restitution. And in this process, we have gone through despair, hopelessness, disappointment, and we still do. We are here at the center of the United Nations, but we present our cases for the last so many years, and we still don't see any concrete movement. That is not to say that we are disrespectful of the United Nations, but we are disappointed with the United Nations. I have a very undiplomatic way of putting it. I say that in the struggle between mind and mouth, the liberal world is failing. United Nations concept and covenants and rules are all about intellectual and mind development and protection of freedom, which constitute mainly about human dignity and inherent human rights. But on the other hand, we have the case of mouth, that is economics. So when it comes to mouth, mind loses battle at every stage. European Union continuously label discrimination against China not having level playing field. Now, it took 30 years for European Union and Western world to accept they have been treated badly by China. So even at the United Nations, we have been present here for so many years. In the initial years in 1959, 61, and 65, we had General Assembly resolution. After that, we had to fight tooth and nail even to get a no-action motion position. The best year was in 1992 when we had 22-22 vote, at that time, Human Rights Commission. Now in Human Rights Council, we have only 7 to 11 countries making routine statements and nothing positive against China. Therefore, my question, my lady, is, now that you have been with the United Nations here for the last few years, and more so indirectly involved from Human Rights Desk from Central Tibetan Administration in Dharamsala, and with your long presentation, what is your way forward?
Thank you so much for the question. I just continue my presentation now. So as a way forward, definitely there is a lot of disappointment. There is a lot of despair when it comes to United Nations. Just to give you an idea, this is United Nations. It is an ocean in itself. So when you are interacting with one part, so the general interactions that we have been having is with the Human Rights Council. Please search where is Human Rights Council in this map, right? It is right under one of the organs, that is the General Assembly. Under the General Assembly, it is the Human Rights Council. We have been fighting there. When I say there is a lot of hope left, is that if you want to take advantage or gain something from the system, you have to understand the system first. You will not be efficiently able to break the laws without knowing the laws. Therefore, I would say that we have a lot more potential and a lot left to explore. For example, if you look at even the Office of High Commissioner of Human Rights, it falls under the Secretariat, right? So where is that again? It's one small well in the ocean. And therefore, I think we have to find new avenues, build up new potentials to understand the system, first of all, and then find those avenues to engage with the UN. Why is engaging with the UN important? It is the only body currently, the only international body which has the largest number of countries present and engaging with. Therefore, even though we might have a lot of despair and disappointment, this is one of the best mechanisms whereby we can engage with the largest number of countries at one go. So some of the systems that, some of the avenues that we can definitely look at would be the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights. This is one of the most important developments that we have seen. The UN has come out with the guiding principles on business and human rights. We have had very less engagement with this. And when we talk about rights, economic rights especially being violated, this is one of the major avenues for us to raise the issues of economic rights violations that are happening. And of course, then you have the International Labour Organization and other organizations which are still yet left to be explored. Coming to the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights Review that is going to happen next year, definitely I would encourage and call upon all the civil societies to please engage with the mechanism. What we have seen is that because of some sort of despair or disappointment, or maybe for any other reason, the lesser the civil society engagement becomes, the bolder China becomes in its violations with impunity. And also, I would suggest if the CTA and especially the Tibet Bureau Geneva can come up with the cumulative recommendations that are presented from this forum that could be submitted to the committee for the review. With regards to the international community, what we have always appealed is that to look at Tibet and China from a holistic approach. We have constantly seen the international community engaging from one fire to another fire. China is creating new Tibets just so that it does not, it distracts the international community. So China has created new Tibet in Xinjiang, a new Tibet in Hong Kong, just so that the international community gets distracted. That is not the approach. You cannot go in a firefighting, reactive approach all the time. It is necessary that when there is a new violation, the older issues are also brought together. And therefore, the international community, when it engages with China, not just looking at the new issues, the new violations, but the continuing violations of Tibet, and take a very holistic approach. Of course, the other avenues that are available are, this is going to be a very lengthy answer, I'm sorry, Kungo, is the OECD guidelines. This is one of the major successes that we have seen, especially working with the Swiss-Tibetan Friendship Association, the Tibet Youth Association for Europe, the Tibetan Women's Association, the Tibetan Community Association here in Switzerland. The four major groups that brought complaint against the International Olympic Committee. So the Olympic Committee has been challenged under the OECD guidelines, and currently the International Olympic Committee is forced to answer. And this is one of the new avenues that has been sort of discovered by the civil societies here, and we are exploring that. So definitely there are a lot more things to be done. Let's not definitely be despaired or disappointment. I think the best conclusion would be of His Holiness saying, never give up, no matter what is going on around you, never give up.
I expected... Bravo. I expected an answer that would say that the United Nations would do this and the United Nations would do that, but you gave way forward for us to do. Anyway, moving to the most eminent third speaker today, Mr. Marco Respinti, an Italian professional journalist, essayist, translator, and lecturer. He contributes to several journals and magazines, both in print and online. both in Italy and abroad. One of his books, published in 2008, concerns human rights in China. A senior fellow at the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal, a non-partisan, non-profit U.S. educational organization based in Mecosta, Michigan. He is also founding member as well as board member of Center for European Renewal, a non-profit, non-partisan, pan-European education organization based in The Hague, the Netherlands. He serves as director in charge of the journal Seigneur and Bitter Winter. Marco was awarded the 2019 FIRMA International Festival of Religion and Music and Arts Award for Journalism promoting religious liberty to honor personalities who promoted religious liberty and interreligious dialogue throughout the world. His topic is the end of poverty under President Xi Jinping.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be, again, once more, part of the Geneva Forum, which I understand is a no-flight zone for speaking the truth in the name of liberty of Tibet, and it is almost one of the only places where Tibetans can make their voice heard to the world. As you heard, I'm not an economist, so I will try to not overlap too much to what my distinguished predecessor just said, but I'm trying to interpret my topic, reading it in the fields I'm most familiar with, human rights and religious liberty, and trying to focus on the background or the rationale, even the philosophical rationale of what is going on economically in Tibet. Our distracted world may have not realized it, but while we were all struggling with our second year of COVID-19, possibly even blaming it partially or totally on China, China accomplished a literal miracle. It ended poverty. Or at least this is what President Xi Jinping claims and tells to the entire world. Xi himself triumphantly gave the news on February 25 this year during a public celebration, saying that absolute poverty was finally eradicated from the most populous country in the world, and the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, People's Daily, celebrated his historical victory with one of its longest articles in recent years. And not only. There was even, sorry, technology is not assisting me. There was also another miracle within the miracle. China did accomplish his mission perfectly on time, respecting its own provisions. Eradicating rural poverty has been a key initiative of Xi Jinping since he came to power in 2012. In most recent years, he set the deadline of this titanic task to the end of the year 2020. So when China announced late last year that it had removed the last remaining counties from a list of poor regions, its officials said it meant it had achieved the goal of eliminating extreme poverty by the set date. In short, mission accomplished. This is all the more impressive if one remembers that while China was able to reach so grand a goal, the rest of the world was suffering a new wave of impoverishment because of the gigantic economic recessions resulted from the new coronavirus pandemics. Of course, the only available certification of Xi Jinping's miracle is Xi Jinping's assertion, which unfortunately is enough for several Western media. But let's go beyond propaganda. Yes, today China is less poor than in the 20th century, but that is quite easy. Mao's lucid ideological folly performed through his famous national campaigns, chiefly but not uniquely the Great Leap Forward, caused famines. This Maoist economic and moral catastrophe was just another example of the total failure of the collectivistic economic theory, which is an essential aspect of Marxism-Leninism and that has never worked throughout history. Again, it is quite easy for anyone, holding collectivistic economic views or not, to be better off, even far better off, than the nightmares of Mao's time. Also because, as all tyrants know quite well, despotism can harass and exploit people only for a certain amount of time. Then it needs to pull relatively back for another amount of time to prevent social outbreaks. This is exactly what post-Mao, and post-Maoism something different, post-Mao Chinese rulers understood and did with the reforms introduced after 1976, the year of Mao's death. Also, the country needed to recover as much as possible and as quick as possible if the CCP wanted to exorcise the ghost of a new unrecoverable economical cataclysm of the kind that later doomed its rival comrade in the rush for the socialist leadership in the world, namely the Soviet Union. We all recall the slogan of the Soviet Sunset Times perestroika, but not all remember that the meaning of that Russian word is restructuring, even renovation. The last Soviet rulers meant, in fact, to relaunch the dying Soviet communism through a maquillage and a lifting that could save it from its own misdeeds and errors, not to abolish it. Soviet rulers failed, but Chinese rulers didn't. The latter were able to craft their own successful perestroika, making the West and their own citizens pay for it. The maxim attributed to Deng, to get rich is glorious, epitomizes the need of the regime to calm down the excesses in order to tame citizens as well as to bring fresh air to the economic field. Many critics say that Deng may have not uttered those specific words. It is possible. But what Deng surely did was inventing the concept of a socialist market economy, creating special economic zones. I'd like to draw your attention on this feature. Deng's was an attempt to refuel socialism through a partial market economy, which was limited to some areas and ultimately controlled by the state. It was not a repeal of Marxist theory. It was an injection of quotas of its opposite, aiming at restructuring and renovating socialism. In one word, perestroika. One should notice the similarities with the new economic policy decided by Lenin in 1921, which saved Soviet Russia from collapsing. This was the original perestroika, which at that time worked for Moscow. And while the second Soviet perestroika failed in the late 1980s, the Chinese one started even earlier on a pure Leninist model, succeeded because it favored a bottom-up strategy that Soviets didn't follow at their own expenses. This excursus on Deng underlines one fundamental thing. It is perfectly fine for communism to exploit the tools of the enemies, economic tools of the enemies, and Deng's economic reform through controlled liberty was perfectly Leninist. And while the favorite phrase of Xi Jinping, socialism with Chinese characteristic, was crafted by post-Mao Leninist Deng, the reverence that Xi has for Deng's economic reform, alongside the similarities that he displays with Mao's cruel repressive policies, make this president for life the perfect Leninist for the new era, and his end of poverty a fantastic weapon to secure the power of the CCP over people. A common trend repeats that post-Mao China moved progressively away from communist collectivism, becoming capitalist. It did not. The Chinese regime is quite proud to define as Marxist-Leninist its one-party, heavily centralized government that allows no dissent, controls its citizens in all possible ways, and uses intimidation, terror, and persecution as an instrument to exert power. China may imitate some misdeeds of a capitalist society, but this doesn't make it a capitalist country, no more than the cheap made-in-China imitation of a handbag makes it a true Gucci. Let me be clear, I'm not a fan of capitalism as such, a word/concept created by French socialists and made famous by Marxists to reduce all human activity to a gross materialistic approach based on money and greed. But for sure, I do cherish economic liberty and private property because they amount to human rights. Now, what the Chinese regime has successfully managed to accomplish is an economic strategy where the liberalization of some economic devices that were once forbidden had been implanted in the Marxist framework. Let me here underline some economic devices, means, not ends. And this limited amount of liberalization based on a fundamental materialistic premise goes hand in hand with no political liberty, no liberty of expression, no religious liberty. Let us now return to Xi miracle, the end of poverty. It is simply a lie. First of all, India's results are comparable to China, and India, with all of its problems, is a democracy. Tanzania in Africa, which did better than China, is regarded by some as only partially democratic, but certainly has more democracy than China, and did not rely on Xi Jinping's thought to achieve its result in the fight against poverty. Second, all depends on how Xi defines poverty. We are all familiar with a few famous words in Lewis Carroll's novel, Through the Looking Glass. When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said in a rather scornful tone, it means just what I choose it to mean. Neither more nor less. The question is, said Alice, whatever you can make, words mean so many different things. The question is, said Humpty Dumpty, which is to be master. That's all. Xi decides what poverty means because Xi is the master, and Xi mastered to make all forget that poverty is not an absolute concept. He arbitrarily fixed the poverty line at an income of $2.30 or 1.89 euros per day, as my colleague Professor Massimo Introvigna pointed out, criticizing Xi's supposed miracle. To magnify his claims, Xi noted that the $2.30 thresholds of Chinese extreme poverty that he arbitrarily fixed is above the World Bank threshold of $1.90. Now, by Xi arbitrary standard, poor in China are now 0% of the total population. But again, the figure used to justify Xi Jinping's miracle are an exclusive decision of Xi. Why should we concentrate on Xi Jinping's falsified data on poverty? Why should we lose time underlying the fallacies of this mere piece of propaganda? Or to say it more directly, what does this specifically have to do with Tibet? The answer lies in a recent report produced and published in May 23rd this year by the State Council Information Office of the People's Republic of China, serving both as a summary of what the Chinese regime has done in Tibet so far and the paramount blueprint for future political direction. It is entitled Tibet since 1951, Liberation, Development and Prosperity. It is not my intention neither to review nor to analyze this document. I just need two examples. First, Chapter 1, entitled Peaceful Liberation, refers to the military occupation of Tibet that caused many Tibetans to escape, among whom His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the expatriates to form a Tibetan government in exile, and those who remained to suffer vexation and persecution. Secondly, Chapter 6, entitled Protection and Development of Traditional Culture, which would be laughable if it were not tragic in face of the cultural genocide that the CCP is waging on against Tibetans. But when in chapter 1, entitled again, Tibet Before the Peaceful Liberation, the reader encounters a phrase such as, quote, Tibet has been an integral part of Chinese territory since ancient times, end of quote, the hermeneutics of this operation becomes crystal clear. This piece of counter-information is in fact designed to convince the world that, A, the Chinese regime is a benevolent government which operates for the best interests of its citizens. B, being Tibet an unalienable part of China, the benevolent nature of the Chinese regime looks carefully and benignly after its cynicized Tibetan citizens. And third, lastly, the intrinsic benevolent nature of the Chinese regime has been able to secure not only the best, but the very top of all conditions for its otherwise miserable and backward Tibetan citizens, finally enlightened by their accord cynicization. I answered no review of Tibet since 1951, and I'm going to my conclusion. I just want to evaluate it. My evaluation concentrates on two main points. I formulate the first, putting a decisive question. Why should the CCP tell lies on the end of poverty? Just for propaganda? No. The CCP needs the lie of the end of poverty to cover the mother of all lies in China and blame it on its scapegoat, the mother of lies being that socialism works and the scapegoat being traditional cultures. Xi Jinping's call it the end of poverty in Tibet in chapter 5 of Tibet since 1951, while it is Tibet which will end in poverty. Before occupation by China, Tibet was not dying in poverty. After the CCP's end of poverty, who does really benefit from the undeniable structures that China built in Tibet? Who is exploiting Tibet's resources? Who is essaying to protect Tibet's culture, language, and religion, while it is actually imposing all sorts of cultural, linguistic, and religious persecution on Tibetans, even to extent of deciding the reincarnation of lamas on one side and relocating thousands of Tibetans in new socialist villages on the other side, making them impoverishing their culture, diluting and controlling their religion, as well as erasing their communal life? I leave you with the burden of finding the answer, but believe me, it is not difficult to guess. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very detailed and excellent presentation on Xi's eradication of poverty. I wanted to further my statement earlier, where I said that mind and mouth struggle, mouth is winning. As Mr. Respinti has said, China is now very proud of its poverty eradication, and that is true. And in any communique issued between any two countries, maybe it's US, China, or EU, China, first thing is they applaud China's poverty eradication. That is the first. Whereas in the past, in all UN documents, it's always the first clause which says the right to self-determination, inherent, inalienable right of human dignity. It's always the dignity, right, and prestige of the person. Today, it's the poverty alleviation. So therefore, predominance of commerce over intellectual and freedom has become the norm of the day. So today, when we are pleased to hear this eradication of poverty, let me tell you, according to 2021 billionaires list of 2,755 billionaires, China has 698 billionaires, and the United States has 724 billionaires. China is a communist socialist country, and the United States is a capitalist. Okay, poverty alleviation is very good, but according to Gini coefficient, if you measure inequality between 0 to 1, China precedes United States. China's inequality is 0.47, whereas United States inequality among its citizens is 0.41. So, according to our basic political science, communism or socialism is each for everyone. Capitalism is each for oneself. But today we are seeing data where things are getting mixed up. Both socialist and capitalist, they are in the same league. So is this winning of mouth over mind? Or is it socialism with Chinese characteristics? Or is it capitalism with Chinese characteristics? So with this, I will open the floor to the audience, and I will give up my right to ask questions to the last speaker so that audience may have more opportunity to ask questions. So please raise your hands and identify yourself and ask question to person that you want to, and identify the speaker. Thank you.
My name is David Missal from Tibet Germany. Thank you all for your presentations. I would like to pose a question to Mr. Zenz regarding the forced labor in Tibet. I was wondering whether we know which Tibetans are chosen to be transferred or not, and if so, how, and whether we know what happens to them when they are not complying to these transfers, and what work exactly they are doing. I mean, you said secondary, tertiary sector, but do we have any examples there? Thank you.
Yes, very good question. So it's a bit similar to Xinjiang, that the focus of labor transfers, and especially the more coercive state labor transfers, is on the more remote rural regions, especially pastoralists, those who are farthest away from industry or wage labor and who have been more resistant to participate. So the coercive edge of poverty alleviation is pointed against those who don't particularly wish to be poverty alleviated in a way that the Chinese Communist Party wants them to. And so if you do not comply with, or those segments of society that have not willingly or semi-willingly participated, or who have not been able to, I mean, there's always been a coercive edge to poverty alleviation, but there have been those who have been more resistant, and those have tended to be the ones who are more wedded to their traditional lifestyles in more remote regions. And so the further you get away from urban centers such as Lhasa, the further you get away from also mixed places where you have more Han Chinese, those really are the recipients of the most coercive poverty alleviation methods. In terms of specific ways, so for example, the poverty alleviation or labor transfer plan has particular plans and provisions to increase the so-called overall quality of these populations, because these more remote traditional rural populations are considered to lack the overall quality of becoming a laborer. The stated goal is to transfer herdsmen and farmers into industrial workers and bring them into modernity. And they're seen as not being able to work a regular factory day, spend 8 hours in a factory. So they get a so-called a basic quality training, whereby they're subjected to basic discipline and drills to prepare them to work a full day in a factory, which they have not done as herding, especially the nomads. So in terms of the particular professions, they're trying, there's a real drive to try to drive a localized production to produce specialty products for a region, such as Tibetan handicraft or Tibetan medicine, or specialized local food products. A lot of that is geared towards tourism or the Eastern Chinese market. Other types are like food processing, and some of you may have heard of, for example, Kofco with Xinjiang tomatoes and Italian tomato paste. Our neighbors here in Italy, they have a habit of importing Xinjiang tomatoes and then putting a label made in Italy on pasta sauce that consists of tomatoes from Xinjiang. And Kofco is also a recipient of Tibetan labor transfers. So food processing, and then there's like driving, like taxi driving, getting driver's licenses, and some other more practical skills that are actually needed. So obviously there's some sort of focus to try to train Tibetans in skills that for which there's potentially or actually a local need. And some are being transferred to other parts to take more part in industrial processing. Thank you. I hope I've answered the questions.
Anyone? Yes, please. Last question. Yes?
Yes, hello. My name is Rachel Furzaki. I do human rights for women dealing with violence, and what I'm hearing described here is something that I would put a different name on, and I think it might be a different way to look at this. The complexity of what we've just been presented with is enormous. If we're going to address this at the level of businesses and countries, there's now a new approach to look at things on supply chain, and the word is trafficking, slavery. If someone's life is put at risk, and that's the only way that they're going to get work, then it boils down to a very simple explanation. And there's a new world since COVID has come and gone, and they've looked at the supply chains. Every business, there's a coming day when every business is going to be responsible for the supply chain, and every country is going to be responsible for their supply chain. And so the human rights abuses that are going on, there's almost no place in the world that doesn't buy Chinese something or other. And so if all of those places are required to do a supply chain examination, and they come up and they see that it goes to Tibet and the Uyghurs, then it's going to create, they're going to have to look at it. It's going to bring it to surface. So I'd like to just present that as an idea, or, it's not pleasant to say that this is slavery, but it is. And so if we call it that and bring it up to the surface, then maybe it'll create a way of talking about it that's different.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your comment. Before I conclude, I'm compelled to give 1 minute to Chickila. She wants to acknowledge someone.
Thank you so much, Kongo, and thank you for the comment. Definitely what you said is the new way of looking, a new perspective that we have to sort of bring in the discourse of discussing a supply chain. In the same spirit, I wanted to acknowledge the presence of course, our chief guest who gave a very important statement yesterday, Vice President of the Senate of Czech Republic. The reason why I'm acknowledging him is that he was the presiding officer for the very important resolution that was passed by Senate on diplomatic boycott of Olympics. And this makes even more significant because this is one of the latest in the recent times that genocide in Tibet has been acknowledged. So definitely for someone who is researching on genocide and cultural genocide, that would be a beginning point and a very important document. Because what we have seen in recent discussion is that definitely there's a lot of genocide discussion that is happening in Xinjiang, but there has been a sidelining of genocide, and especially the cultural genocide in Tibet that has happened. So this resolution of diplomatic boycott makes that acknowledgement and highlights the crimes against humanity. So thank you so much, Vice President Ziri. I think that is very important. And also just one last statement on what can be further done is that in 2017, there was the China Tribunal which discussed at length the organ harvesting that has been happening in Tibet, in Xinjiang, and other parts of China. And they came up with a 563-page judgment. Similarly, now the Uyghur Tribunal is happening on genocide in Xinjiang. Definitely we can look at ways where, if not genocide in Tibet, but definitely genocide in, cultural genocide in Tibet can be presented to such tribunals, and thereby sort of documenting what has happened in Tibet in legal terms, because currently there's a lot of anthropological discussion, a lot of discussion on what is happening on policy-wise, but definitely there needs to be a legal documentation of this. So some sort of that opportunity as well. Thank you so much, Kumar.
Thank you, Chickila. Thank you, Dr. Zenz. Thank you, Mr. Respinti. And thank you very much to the audience. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Kungo, and thank you to all our speakers. May I request Kungo Chimirinzila, representative of Tibet Bureau Geneva, to offer Tibetan scarf or kata. Mr. Marco Respinti, please. Not give it all. Chickila. Dr. Zenz. Thank you so much. We now break for lunch.